All right, let's work through a few example problems from chapter 21. This chapter is going to have us working with equivalent units. When companies are making inventory for which it's hard to differentiate one job from another, when we are accumulating costs of producing that inventory, we need some way to assign the manufacturing cost incurred to units produced. This first problem has us working with the number of units that a company had been working on during the period, and of those units, how much of those units were completed. Okay. So let's take a look at this. Shady company. Materials are entered at the beginning of each process. That means all direct materials that the company needs to produce their inventory are all added at the very beginning of the production process. Work in process inventories with the percentage of work done on conversion cost and product data for its sterilizing department during the months of 2017 are as follows. Okay, so they just gave us a few months here: January, March, May, and July. They have given us how much they had sitting in beginning work in process for each of those months. This means if they had no beginning work in process, there was no inventory that had been started on in a prior period or a prior month that hadn't been completed, because they started each month with no inventory in process. Okay. Now for each of these months, these are the number of units that were transferred out. If these units were transferred out of this production department, that means they had to have been entirely complete. They must have had all their materials added to them, and they had all of their conversion costs. And conversion costs are the labor and overhead, the direct labor and manufacturing overhead combined. These were the number of units that were still in process at the end of these months. And this is the percentage of completion with respect to conversion costs, the direct labor and overhead. There is no percentage completion for materials because all of these units that had been started had all of their materials entered at the beginning. Okay, so there is no partial completion for materials. All units completed and transferred out, and all units that are still being worked on have all of their materials. Okay. Biggest difference between the units transferred out and the units still in process is that the units that are in process still need to have some of their labor and overhead efforts added to them to complete them. We are going to compute physical units, or we're going to follow the flow of units for 2 months. We're just going to pick the month of January and the month of May. Both of these months started with no units in beginning inventory. Right? Neither one of them had any units in process. The number of units of inventory that must have been started during those months would include everything that had been transferred out, plus all of the units that were still in process. Because if they started with 0 units, during the month they completed 11,600, they have another 1870 that had been started but not completed. It means they must have had 13,470 units started into production during January. Okay. Same thing with May. They started with 0. 15,100 units were transferred out. 7,140 units are still in process at the end of the period. 15,100 plus 1,720. See, if I would pick the right month here, we'd be a lot better off, right? Sorry about that. 15,100 plus 7,140 means they started 22,240 units of inventory. Total units of inventory that they had been working on during the month of January was 13,470 and May 22,240. We know that of the total units started in January, 11,600 were completed and transferred out. Of the total units in process during the month of May, 15,100 were transferred out. They were completed. Units in ending inventory for each of those months accounts for the total units that had been in process during the 2 months. Now let's calculate the equivalent units. Remember, equivalent units are going to be taking into account the number of units that could have been made if the amount of the material efforts or the amount of the conversion efforts had only focused on making whole units. Let's start with materials. The number of units that the company had transferred out during January were 11,600 units, and they had 1,870 in process. To calculate the total number of equivalent units for January, we will take into account the units that were 100% complete because they were transferred out. 11,600 units were completed and transferred out. We know that they must have been 100% complete or had all their materials. Otherwise, they would not have been completed and transferred out. In addition to that, they had another 1,870 units that were still in process at the end of January. We know those are 100% complete because all materials are added at the beginning of the process. So in January, the total number of equivalent units that could have been made if they had only focused on making whole units are 13,470. Now, to make it pretty clear the difference, what do I mean by equivalent units? Let's take a look at conversion units, conversion cost equivalent units for January. We have to calculate equivalent units separate during January for materials and for conversion cost because materials are all added at the very beginning of the production process. Remember, all materials are entered at the beginning. However, the direct labor and overhead, or the cost incurred, the efforts incurred to complete from materials to the ending product, are only partially complete. So materials are added at a different rate from the labor and overhead. In order to figure out the equivalent units, we have to do it separately for those two types of efforts. Okay, hopefully that makes sense because they're implemented or applied at different rates to come up with a completed product. In January, of the 11,600 units that were completed and transferred out, if they were completed and transferred out, they had to have had all of their conversion efforts or their conversion costs added to them. So those physical units are the same as their equivalent units. However, for the units that were in process at the end of January, they only had 60% of their conversion costs added to them. If I were to multiply the units in ending work in process in January times the percentage completion, I come up with 1,122 equivalent units. What that means is if the company had only applied conversion cost to those units that were in process at the end of January and only made whole units before starting a new inventory item, they could have made the equivalent of 1,122 whole units. In other words, instead of having 1,870 partially completed units, the equivalent units are 1,122. Total equivalent units of production with respect to conversion costs in January are 12,722. Okay. Let's see what happens in March. Again, in March, they had 12,600 units completed and transferred out, and 4,070 units still in process at the end of the period. With respect to materials, those units are 100% complete. They have all materials added to them. So 12,600 and 4,070 at 100% complete means equivalent units of 16,670. For conversion cost, 12,600 units transferred out, they are 100% complete with respect to conversion because they wouldn't have been transferred out if they weren't complete. However, the 4,070 still being worked on at the end of the period were only 33% complete, which means to calculate equivalent units with respect to conversion costs, 12,600, 100% fully complete, and another 4,070 that are only 33% complete, or 1,343 equivalent units. Total equivalent units for March with respect to conversion, 13,943. In May, 15,100 transferred out, 7,140 in process. With respect to conversion, those ending work in process are only 80% complete. That means that for materials, the units transferred out plus the units in ending inventory are 100% complete. Total equivalent units with respect to materials, 22,240. With respect to conversion costs, 15,100 completed and transferred out, plus the 7,140 that are only 80% complete with respect to conversion, means total equivalent units during May with respect to conversion costs are 20,812. Finally, in July, 10,200 completed and transferred out, 1,720 in process that are 47% complete with conversion. 10,200 plus 1,720 with respect to materials, 100% complete, total equivalent units of 11,920. Conversion cost, 10,200 completed and transferred out, 100% complete with respect to conversion, and 1,720 units in process at the end of the period that are 47% complete with respect to conversion cost. Total equivalent units of 11,008. Okay, so now that you have an understanding of how to kind of track the physical flow of inventory and the ability to calculate equivalent units, let's apply it to this exercise. The sanding department of Ortiz Furniture Company has the following production and manufacturing cost data for March of 2010. It is its very first month of operations. Their production. They had 12,000 units that were finished and transferred out. 3,000 units of inventory were started that had all of their materials. They were 100% complete with materials and 20% complete with respect to conversion costs. During that first month of operations, these were the manufacturing or the product costs incurred: materials, labor, and overhead. When we prepare a production cost report, we are trying to reconcile the units produced with the cost incurred. Okay. Taking a look here, the first step in a production cost report is to trace the physical flow of units. Okay. So here we are going to start with figuring out what units we need to account for. Remember, this is a brand new company, so they had 0 units in process at the beginning of the period. During the month, they started 15,000 units into production. How do I know there's 15,000 units? Because if they had 12,000 units that they completed and transferred out, and 3,000 were still being worked on at the end of the month, they must have started 15,000 units during the period. So they have a total of 15,000 units that were in process. Of those 15,000 units, let's account for them. 12,000 of the 15,000 that had been started were completed and transferred out to the next production department. The other 3,000 were still in process at the end of the month. Okay. So we have traced the physical flow of the inventory through the production process. Now we are going to calculate the equivalent units. Because these units are produced by first putting all their materials in, all 15,000 units have 100% complete of the materials added right away. But those units in ending inventory are only 20% complete with respect to conversion, direct labor, and indirect cost, overhead. Why is it only the ending inventory is only partially complete? Well, if you think about if these units were finished and transferred out, they had to have had all of the materials and all of their conversion cost efforts added. However, the 3,000 units that are still being worked on had all their materials, but they hadn't had all of their conversion added to them yet. That's why they're not complete. To calculate the equivalent units, we do it separately for materials and then for conversion costs. We do it separately, remember, because these are added at different rates in the production process. So starting with materials, of the 12,000 units transferred out, they had all of their materials added. 12,000 times 100% means equivalent units, 12,000. Work in process, the stuff still remaining in production at the end of the period. 3,000 physical units that had all of their materials. 3,000 times 100% completion with respect to materials. 3,000 equivalent units. Total equivalent units for the month of March with respect to materials, 15,000. Now calculating it for conversion, 12,000 units completed and transferred out. That must have been, and let me just type it in here so you can see the difference. Those had to have been 100% complete. 12,000 units times 100% complete, equivalent units of 12,000. However, of the work that was in process, 3,000 units, they only had 20% of their conversion added to them. 3,000 times their percentage completion means 600 equivalent units with respect to conversion. Total equivalent units for the month of March with respect to conversion costs are 12,600. What this tells me is that if they had only made whole products using the amount of materials and conversion efforts that were done, they would have been able to make 15,000 units with respect to materials, but they could have only made 12,600 whole units with respect to labor and overhead. Okay. All right, continuing on here. Now that we have the equivalent units calculated, we can now come up with a cost per equivalent unit. Total material costs were 33,000. Labor and overhead, or the conversion costs, were 27,000 plus 36,000. 27,000 plus 36,000, total conversion cost of 63,000. To come up with the cost per equivalent unit, I will take the total material cost of 33,000 and divide by the number of equivalent units, $2.20. For conversion, total cost of $63,000 for labor and overhead, divide by the equivalent units, $5 in conversion cost. I have now accounted for the total cost incurred during the month to produce some complete and some partially completed units, and I've accounted for them on a per equivalent unit basis. $2.20 per equivalent unit for materials and $5 with respect to conversion. The total equivalent unit cost, $7.20. Those total of $96,000 had to do with the cost associated with the units started in production, because we didn't have any cost sitting in beginning work in process, because there were none. Okay, there were no units in process when we started. Finally, what we're now going to do is reconcile and figure out, of the $96,000 in total costs, how much of those costs need to be associated with the units transferred out, and how much of those $96,000 in cost need to stay in work in process associated with the units that are still being worked on. Okay, because remember, as we were producing and recording these production costs, as we were working on the inventory, all of those costs were recorded into work in process. However, when we prepared the journal entry to transfer some of those costs out to finished goods or to the next work in process account, we need to know how much of those total production costs are associated with the units completed and transferred out, and how much of those costs are associated with units we are still working on. So to do that, we will take the equivalent units transferred out. Total equivalent units transferred out were the same for both materials and for conversion. Thus, the total cost to transfer out need to be at the full equivalent cost per unit. Total 12,000 units transferred out at a total equivalent unit cost of $7.20. We need to transfer 86,400 out of work in process and into the next work in process account or into finished goods. Then for the material or the work that was in process, the 3,000 equivalent units with respect to materials, we need to assign $2.20, which is our material equivalent unit cost. $6,600 of material costs need to stay in work in process, associated with the units that were in process but not done. And for conversion, 600 equivalent units at a conversion cost per equivalent unit of $5, or $3,000 in conversion costs need to stay in work in process. Okay. In other words, $86,400 needs to be transferred out of work in process, and we need to leave $9,600 of those production costs staying in work in process. Okay. So what this production cost report does is it reconciles and assigns costs so we can figure out what needs to be transferred out and what needs to stay in work in process. All right, let's do one more problem to try to make this all come together. The welding department of Batista Manufacturing has the following production and manufacturing cost data for the month of February. All materials are added at the beginning of the process. Here are the manufacturing costs. They had a total of $32,175 in work in process when they started the period. Those costs are associated with inventory they had started on the last period and are now completing during this period. In addition to that, during the current month, they added more materials, labor, and overhead costs. Okay, These two lumped together give us the conversion cost. Then we had beginning work in process. We had these are the physical units. 15,000 units were on hand at the beginning of the month that hadn't been completed last month. 49,000 units were transferred out during the month. 60,000 units were started. And we have 26,000 units still in process at the end of the month that are 1/5 complete. We are going to prepare a production cost report. Step 1, trace the physical flow of units. We were starting with 15,000 units, and then we started another 60,000 more. 15,000 units in beginning work in process, 60,000 units started, a total of 75,000 units in process. Of the 75,000 units that were in process during the month, 49,000 were completed and transferred out, and 26,000 were still on hand. Okay. We have accounted for the physical flow of the inventory through the production process this month. Now let's calculate equivalent units. To calculate equivalent units, we take the number of units times their percentage completion. For the units transferred out, they wouldn't have been transferred out if they didn't have all their materials and if they didn't have all of their conversion costs. 49,000 times 100% complete with respect to materials, 49,000 units. 49,000 units times 100% complete with respect to conversion, 49,000 equivalent units. For the work in process that was still on hand at the end of the month, 26,000 units. All materials were added at the beginning, so we know 26,000 times 100% complete, 26,000 equivalent units. For the 26,000 that are still in process at the end of the month, they were 1/5 complete, or 20%, multiplying 26,000 times 1 divided by 5, 5,200 equivalent units. Number of units times their percentage completion. Total equivalent units with respect to conversion, 54,200. We know the equivalent units now. Let's add up our cost. The total cost that we had in work in process during the month consists of the beginning inventory cost plus what we added. Materials, we had $18,000 of material cost already in work in process. We added another $180 more during the month. Total material cost of $198. Conversion cost. We started the month with $14,175 of conversion cost in the work in process account. We added another $32,780 and $61,445. If we add those up, we get total conversion cost of $1,084. Total costs that we need to account for, or the total cost of production sitting in work in process, $3,064. Dividing our total cost by our equivalent units separately for materials and conversion, I get a cost per equivalent unit with respect to materials, and total conversion cost divided by equivalent units with conversion, total cost per equivalent unit with respect to conversion of $2. The total cost per equivalent unit is $464, which is the material cost and the conversion cost per unit combined. Okay. So now that we have the total cost that we need to account for, we are going to assign them by multiplying the cost per equivalent unit times the equivalent units. Okay. transferred out. 49,000 units were transferred out. They were 100% complete. Total equivalent unit per unit cost of $464. We need to transfer out 227,360 out of work in process and into the next account. We will leave the remaining amount in there, but let's reconcile it. 26,000 equivalent units with respect to materials in ending work in process times the cost per equivalent unit for materials. 68,640 needs to stay in work in process for the material cost. And conversion, total equivalent units with respect to conversion cost, still in process, 5,200 at a per unit cost of $2. 10,400 needs to stay in there in the work in process account for conversion. Total costs that need to remain in work in process, 79,040. What this tells us is of the total costs that have been recorded in work in process during the month, adding all those up, those total costs come to 3,064. Of the total costs recorded in work in process, 227 have been associated or needs to be transferred out because that is associated with the completed inventory, and 79,040 needs to remain in work in process because those costs are associated with inventory not yet completed.